Maybe right now what scares you most isn't failure. It's the possibility that you're walking outside of God's will without even realizing it. You still pray, still go to church, still try to do the right thing, but deep inside, there's a restlessness you can't explain anymore. Because there are seasons when God doesn't lead you through comfort. He leads you through awakening. And the strange thing is, the sign that you're walking in God's will sometimes feels like everything inside you is being broken apart. I know that sounds terrifying, because I used to think, if I'm going the right way, I should feel more certain, stronger, more at peace. But then I realized, some signs from God don't pull you into comfort. They pull you out of your old self. And the final sign was what made me realize God had never left me, even in the seasons when I felt the most lost. I used to think people who are walking in God's will always feel sure. They know what they're doing, know where they're going, know why everything is happening. But then there was a season in my life when I started losing all of that certainty. I still prayed, still read the Bible, still tried to live like a person of faith. But deep inside, there was an exhaustion I couldn't explain anymore. Not physical exhaustion, but the kind of exhaustion that comes when your soul is trying to keep living in a place it no longer belongs. Have you ever felt that way? When you look at your life from the outside, everything still seems fine. You still work, still smile, still fulfill your responsibilities, still say, God is good. But inside, everything keeps getting quieter. There were nights when I would lie there staring at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. Not because of too much noise, but because one question kept circling in my mind. What if I'm going the wrong way? I was afraid to say that to anyone, because in Christian environments, people usually only talk about victory, about blessings, about strong faith. No one really talks about the feeling of loving God while also feeling lost. So I kept pretending. I kept living as if everything were normal. But do you know what happens when a soul lives in pretending for too long? It starts to go numb. You don't really feel joy anymore, but you don't fully feel pain either. You just exist. And that was what scared me most. Not failure, not hardship, but the possibility that I would spend my whole life half alive and half dead like that. One evening after work, I sat in my car for nearly 40 minutes without wanting to get out. Everything that day had been completely normal. No crisis, no one had hurt me, no bad news. But inside, I felt terrifyingly empty. I remember staring into the rearview mirror for a long time. Then a thought entered my mind so clearly that I couldn't ignore it anymore. You no longer belong here. I immediately pushed it away, because honestly, I didn't want to hear that. I had spent too many years building the life I had. I didn't want to start over, didn't want to lose stability, didn't want to become the kind of person who is too emotional and ruins everything. So I did what many of us still do. I tried to rush back into my old life. I worked harder, stayed busier, became more disciplined. I thought, maybe I just need to push a little more. But the harder I pushed, the more exhausted my soul became. That's when I started to understand the first sign. The first sign, God begins to take away your peace with your old life. And the painful part is, it's often the life you once prayed for Him to give you. You prayed for that job, that relationship, that opportunity, that life. Then one day, you start realizing you no longer feel peace in it. This confuses a lot of people because they think, if God gave this to me before, why do I now feel lost inside it? I used to think that too, until I realized some places are right for one season, but no longer right for the next. And the sign that God is pulling you forward usually begins with your soul no longer being able to rest in the old place. You try to go back to how things were before, but you can't. You try to find the old feeling again, but it's gone. Because God no longer lets you stay comfortable with the old version of yourself. That's not punishment, that's awakening. And maybe that's exactly what's happening to you right now. The second sign, you begin to feel your soul slowly dying when you keep living the same old way. The most terrifying thing is not when your life falls apart. It's when everything still functions normally, but your soul no longer feels alive inside it. I stayed in that season longer than I want to admit, and the dangerous part was no one around me noticed. Because you still function. You still go to work, still reply to messages, still fulfill your responsibilities, still smile at the right moments, still say, God is good. But inside, everything keeps getting darker. There were mornings when I woke up and the first thing I felt wasn't hope. It was heaviness. Not because I hated my life, not because something terrible had happened, but because deep inside, I knew I was continuing to live in a version of myself that no longer felt real. Do you understand that feeling? When you start feeling like you're performing the role of yourself every single day. You know what to say, know how to behave, know how to make people think you're okay. But the more you do that, the farther you drift from who you really are, and eventually your soul begins to react, not with screaming, but with numbness. You no longer feel excited about the things that once made you happy. You no longer feel alive. You no longer feel God's presence the way you used to. Everything becomes routine. Even faith becomes routine. You pray, but it feels like your prayers only hit the ceiling and fall back down. You open the Bible, but nothing reaches your heart anymore. You go to church, but inside you still feel empty. And the thing that scares you most is, you begin wondering whether God is drifting away from you. I used to think that too. I used to think, maybe I did something wrong. Maybe God is no longer near. Maybe I'm losing my faith. But then I realized something painful. Sometimes the emptiness doesn't come because God left you. It comes because your soul can no longer endure living far from where He is calling you to go. And that is a huge difference. One night I remember sitting in my living room long after everyone else had gone to sleep. No music, no phone, no TV, just silence. I looked around the house I had worked so hard to build. Everything was exactly what I had once prayed for. A stable job, a stable life, everything stable. But I no longer felt peace. I hated myself for that. I felt guilty because I thought, there are so many people out there wishing they had this life, so why doesn't it feel like enough to me? But you know what? That's how many people get trapped in the wrong life for them. They stay only because they feel guilty for wanting more than what God is truly calling them into. They lock their souls inside a place smaller than their true purpose, then call it humility. But God did not create you just to survive each day. He did not create you for your soul to slowly die in silence. He did not create you to wake up every morning feeling, this is no longer who I really am. And maybe what I'm about to say will reach very deeply into you. Sometimes the clearest sign that God is pulling you forward is that you can no longer pretend to be happy in your old life. You try. You truly try. You try to be grateful. Try to stay positive, try to fix your mindset. But deep inside, there is still a part of you whispering, you were created for more than this. Not more in terms of money or fame, but more in terms of life, more in terms of purpose, more in terms of truth, more in terms of closeness with God. And the painful part is, to step into that, you usually have to let part of your old life die first. That was where I resisted God the longest. I wanted new life, but I didn't want to lose the old version of myself. I wanted purpose, but I still wanted comfort. I wanted God to lead me, but I still wanted control. And you cannot keep both forever. There comes a moment when God brings you to a crossroads where you must decide, do you want to continue living safely, or do you want to truly live? That was when I began to understand the emptiness I felt was not a sign that God had abandoned me. Maybe it was a sign that He was no longer allowing me to stay asleep. The third sign, God begins breaking the old version of you. There is something very few people honestly tell you about walking in God's will. It is this: Before he uses you, he will often break many things inside you first, not to humiliate you, not to punish you, but because there are versions of you that cannot enter where he is leading you. I did not understand that for a very long time. I kept thinking that if God loved me, he would make everything easier. But instead, he began touching the very things I most wanted to keep. Control, ego, the need for other people's approval, the feeling of security, the stable image I had spent years building. And honestly, I hated that process, because no one enjoys feeling like they are being dismantled from the inside out. There were days when I felt like God was making everything harder instead of easier. The things that once made me feel confident started losing their weight. The things that once made me feel valuable could no longer touch my soul. It was as if God was quietly draining life out of the very things I used to define myself. And that hurt deeply. Do you know why? Because many of us do not truly know who we are outside the roles we carry. If you lose that job, who are you then? If you lose that image, do you still have value? If no one recognizes you anymore, do you still know who you are before God? Those were the questions that started haunting me, and I realized I had built too much of my identity on temporary things. I said I trusted God, but deep inside I still needed success to feel important. I still needed stability to feel safe. I still needed people's approval to feel worthy. And then God began touching all of those things, not all at once, but very slowly, like a craftsman carefully removing old layers from a decaying house. There was a season when everything inside me became chaotic. I became more irritable, more exhausted, more impatient. I no longer recognized myself. And the most frightening part was I could not go back to the old version of myself. Have you ever felt that way? Like God opened your eyes and now you can no longer pretend to stay asleep. You no longer enjoy the things that once made you happy. You no longer find peace in the old places. You can no longer tolerate living shallow the way you used to. And that makes you feel lonely, because everyone around you still lives normally. But you alone feel like something inside you is dying, while at the same time something else is trying to be born. That is the painful part of transformation. No one tells you that when God begins renewing you, there will be a period where you no longer belong to the old version of yourself, but have not yet fully stepped into the new one. That is the transition zone. And that place is very lonely. You are no longer who you used to be, but the future is still unclear. You only know this: you cannot continue living the old way anymore. There is one night I remember very clearly. I was sitting alone on the living room floor close to midnight. No lights on, no music, just a faint light coming through the window. I felt exhausted. Not the kind of exhaustion that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes when you have fought too long to hold on to a version of yourself that God is asking you to let go of. And for the first time, I stopped asking God to fix my circumstances. I simply said, I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I would feel ashamed saying that. But strangely, that was the moment I felt God closest to me in many months. Because finally, I stopped trying to appear strong before him. Maybe this is what you need to hear right now. God does not need the perfect version you are trying to perform. He wants the real you. No mask, no performance, no pretending to be okay. And many times the first thing he must break is the false version of yourself you use just to survive. That hurts, deeply, because the ego is always afraid of dying. The flesh always wants to return to what feels familiar. You want to hold on to the old approval, the old sense of control, the old image, the old life, even while your soul is dying inside it. But listen to me carefully. If God is breaking something inside you, that does not always mean he is destroying you. Maybe he is setting you free, because sometimes the most dangerous version of yourself is not the sinful version. It is the stable version that is far from what God truly created you to become. And that was when I began to understand the third sign. When you are walking in God's will, He will not only change your life, He will begin changing the very person you are becoming. The fourth sign: you are still afraid, but you can no longer keep running away. There is a very strange kind of change that happens when God truly begins pulling you toward His will. The fear does not disappear. You still tremble, still worry, still don't know what the future will look like. But at the same time, you also can no longer go back to living the way you used to. That was where I stood for a very long time. I wish I could say that when I finally realized God was leading me in a different direction, I immediately became full of faith and strength. No, I was terrified. There were days when I tried bargaining with God. Can it not require that much change? Can I keep my old life but still be closer to you? Can I obey but in a safer way? Have you ever prayed like that? The kind of prayer that sounds like surrender on the outside, but deep down you are still trying to hold on to control. I did that for a very long time, because the hardest part about walking in God's will is not hearing His voice. It is accepting that His voice will change your life. And if we are being honest, many of us prefer inspiration over transformation. We like feeling moved, touched, inspired by a powerful message. But when God truly starts asking us to walk, everything becomes completely different. Because now, the cost is real. You have to let go of something, leave something behind, face something. And that is where many people stop. Not because they do not love God, but because they are too afraid of losing the life they currently have. I remember one morning, I stood outside the office door for a very long time. My hand rested on the doorknob, but I would not open it. I knew I no longer belonged there. I knew my soul was slowly dying there. I knew God was pulling me forward, but I still stood still. Do you know why? Because part of me still hoped, maybe I do not really have to change. Maybe this feeling will disappear. Maybe if I just try harder, everything will go back to normal. But deep inside, I knew. When God awakens your soul, you cannot go back to sleep the same way again. And that is both beautiful and painful. Beautiful because you finally begin living honestly. Painful because the false version of you has to die. One night I drove around aimlessly for nearly an hour without knowing where I was going. The rain was pouring heavily, streetlights blurred through the water on the windshield. I barely turned on any music. I just sat there listening to the windshield wipers repeating the same sound in silence. And then a question entered my mind so clearly that I had to pull over to the side of the road. If I keep living like this for another 5 years, what will happen to my soul? I could not answer it. Because for the first time, I saw very clearly what my future would look like if I kept running away. Everything might still appear fine on the outside. I could still make money, still be respected, still maintain a good image. But inside, I would drift farther and farther away from the person God created me to become. And that was when I understood, sometimes the greatest pain is not change. It is staying in the place God already called you to leave. Maybe this is what you are feeling right now. You still function, still keep going, still complete everything. But deep inside, there is a part of your soul quietly crying out for help. Not because you are weak, but because you were created for more than mere existence. Some people live their entire lives without ever truly awakening, without ever truly facing God's calling inside them. They silence it with busyness, comfort, social media, work, constant distractions. But when God truly begins pulling you toward Him, there comes a point where distractions are no longer strong enough. The unrest keeps returning, the calling keeps returning, the feeling of "this is not where I belong" keeps returning, until eventually you must make a choice. I resisted that choice for a very long time, until one day I realized I was afraid of two things: afraid to move forward, and afraid of spending my entire life never moving forward at all. And honestly, the second fear started becoming greater. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I stopped being afraid, but because for the first time, I no longer wanted fear deciding my life for me. That was when I understood the fourth sign. When you are walking in God's will, the fear may still remain, but obedience begins growing bigger than the fear. The fifth sign, your soul begins coming back to life, even though the road becomes harder. There is something I never understood when I was younger. I used to think, if I truly walked in God's will, life would become easier, less painful, less stressful, less fighting. But the older I became, the more I realized there are roads that are very easy to walk, but your soul slowly dies on them. And there are roads that are very hard, but every step makes your soul come alive again. That is what started happening to me after I finally stopped resisting God. Not everything suddenly became perfect. In fact, many things became harder than before. My finances were no longer as stable. The future was no longer as clear. I no longer felt like I had everything under control. There were mornings when I woke up, still afraid, still wondering, did I really hear God correctly? What if I am wrong? What if everything falls apart? But at the same time, something completely different was happening inside me. My soul was beginning to wake up again, and that feeling is very difficult to describe if you have never experienced it. It is like something inside you had been asleep for a very long time, and now it could finally breathe again. I remember one very ordinary morning. I was standing in my small kitchen making coffee. Sunlight came through the window. Everything was quiet. No great miracle, no voice from heaven. But for the first time in many years, I felt real peace. Not peace because everything had answers, but peace because I knew, finally, I was no longer betraying what God was doing inside my heart. Do you know what is strange? Many years earlier, I had more money, more stability, more recognition, but I did not have that peace. Because true peace does not come from your life being fine. It comes when your soul stops resisting where God is leading you. Maybe this is what you are missing right now. Not another sign, not another prophecy, not another confirmation, but the courage to stop returning to your old life. Because there is something I realized. You cannot step into a new season with God if you are still constantly looking back at Egypt. So many people pray, Lord, change my life. But when He starts removing old comfort, old identity, old places, the old self, they panic and run backward again. Not because they are bad people, but because the flesh always prefers what is familiar over what is holy. Even when what is familiar is killing their soul day by day. I used to be like that. There were weeks when I almost wanted to return to everything. Return to my old job, return to my old routine, return to the old version of myself. Because transformation is exhausting. It makes you feel fragile, uncertain, vulnerable. But every time I thought about going back, something inside my soul immediately reacted. As if deep down I knew, I cannot live the old way anymore. That was when I understood. Real life had finally begun returning. Not when my struggles disappeared, but when my soul finally started agreeing with God. Maybe you are hearing this and you feel the same way. You are still afraid, still do not know what the future looks like, still do not have all the answers. But at the same time, there is a part of you slowly coming back to life. You begin to feel more deeply, pray more honestly, hate fake living more, become more sensitive to God's voice, no longer tolerate a shallow life. That is not random, that is a sign. A sign that God is no longer leaving you comfortable in the old version of yourself. And maybe that is exactly what you prayed for a long time ago, even though at the time you did not understand the cost of it. Because everyone wants purpose, until God begins requiring surrender. Everyone wants to be used by God, until He begins breaking your ego. Everyone wants to live in God's will, until it requires them to let go of the life that makes them feel safe. But listen to me very carefully. If your soul is slowly coming back to life today, do not go back to sleep again. Do not return to the place God called you out of. Do not call his calling being too sensitive. Do not call spiritual awakening an emotional crisis. Maybe this is the first season in many years that you are truly beginning to live. And that is the final sign. When you are walking in God's will, even if the road becomes harder, even if the future is still not completely clear, even if you are still trembling with fear, your soul begins coming back to life in a way the world could never give you. And once you have tasted that kind of life, you will no longer want to return to the old version of yourself. And maybe, after everything you have just heard, the thing that moves you most is not my story, but because deep inside, you know God has been trying to reach your soul for a very long time. You were just too busy to listen, too afraid to face it, too exhausted to change, too familiar with your old life. So you kept existing while a part of you slowly died inside. I understand that feeling. I know what it feels like to wake up every day when your soul no longer feels alive. I know what it feels like to smile in front of people, but at night feel so empty you cannot explain it. I know what it feels like to pray, while deep inside there is still a quiet voice saying, "This is not where you belong." And the most painful part is, you spent a long time trying to silence that voice. You called it stress, burnout, overthinking, a life crisis, emotional instability. But maybe it is not a breakdown. Maybe it is awakening. Maybe God is no longer allowing you to stay asleep inside a life that is too small for the purpose he placed inside you. Think about that very slowly. If today you still feel empty, even though everything outside looks fine, if you still feel restless, even though your life is good enough, if you can no longer return to the old version of yourself, maybe that is not a sign God has abandoned you. Maybe it is a sign he is drawing you closer. Because when God truly begins leading a soul, he will no longer let that soul stay comfortable with false living. He will make you uncomfortable with shallow living, compromise, pretending, places where life no longer exists, not to make you suffer, but to save you from spending your whole life without ever truly becoming the person he created you to be. There is something that took me a very long time to finally accept. It is this. Sometimes God loves you so deeply that he will not allow you to stay at peace in the place that is killing your soul. That sounds painful, doesn't it? But that is real love, because it would be much easier if he allowed you to keep sleeping, keep staying comfortable, keep living the life everyone else thinks is good, while inside you drift farther and farther away from him. But God does not do that. He keeps calling, keeps awakening you, keeps making you restless, keeps pulling your soul toward life, even when you resist, even when you are afraid, even when you are not fully ready. And maybe that is why you are hearing these words today, not by accident, not just to feel emotional for a few minutes and then continue living the same way, but because something inside your soul is beginning to wake up again. So right now, I do not want you to keep analyzing everything anymore. I do not want you to keep trying to rationalize what God is doing in your heart anymore. Just be honest, even if only for a few seconds. Ask yourself, am I truly alive anymore? Am I moving closer to the person God created me to become? Or am I just existing in a life that makes everyone else comfortable? And if the answer hurts you, do not run from it. Maybe that pain is exactly where healing begins. Pray with me. Lord, I am tired. I am tired of pretending to be strong. I am tired of trying to keep everything under control. I am tired of continuing to live in a place where my soul no longer has life. If you are calling me forward, please give me the courage to listen. If there is something inside me that needs to die, please do not let me keep holding on to it out of fear. I do not want to spend my whole life without ever truly walking in your will. Even if I cannot yet see the entire path, teach me to trust you enough to take one more step. And if my soul is waking up, please do not let me fall asleep again. Amen. If today you feel like something inside your heart has just been awakened, leave this in the comments. I will keep moving forward even while afraid. I want to read that, and I believe many other people need to see that. They are not the only ones struggling with fear, with change, with God's calling inside them. And if this video reached the deepest place in your heart, subscribe to the God Heals prayer channel so we can continue walking together through the seasons where God is healing, awakening, and leading our souls back to Him. Because sometimes the clearest signs that you are walking in God's will are not that your life becomes easier, but that you no longer feel at peace with your old life. Your soul begins awakening. God breaks the false version of you. Obedience begins becoming greater than fear. And finally, your soul begins coming back to life in a way this world could never give you.